Hey guys, how's it going? John here from flighttraining.com, and today we're going to be going over how to plan an IFR cross-country flight. So if you're already a private pilot, you're starting to study for your instrument training, and you're getting to that point in your instrument training where you're about to start planning cross-country flights, we're going to walk you through every single step needed to go through from start to finish to successfully plan an IFR cross-country compared to a VFR cross-country. And we'll go ahead and use a little helpful checklist along the way too to make sure we get every single step included in this process and we don't miss any. So for starters, of course, we have to figure out where we're going. And today, we're going to be going from the Venice airport to the Gainesville airport. So I'll go ahead and type in KVNC to KGNV and just kind of take a quick glance over what that route looks like. So if we were to go direct, we would be going through some Bravo airspace, not too big a deal when you're flying IFR, and about 157 miles to cover. So we're going to go ahead and plan this because planning anything with GPS is pretty easy. We're going to plan this as if we don't have GPS. Maybe we just have like an old school Trimble GPS on the panel or just have our iPad with us. And so we have GPS, but it's not legal to navigate with. So we're going to file it slant-uniform, and we're going to go ahead and plan this whole cross-country as if we just have VORs to navigate off of. So for starters, now we know we're going Venice to Gainesville. Next thing I want to do is figure out what kind of route I'm going to take. So are there any preferred routes between the two airports? Definitely not between a small airport like Venice and a small airport like Gainesville. We can see here that when I go to preferred routes, for like Tampa to Charlotte, there's a preferred route for the airlines and for jets to fly, but there's not going to be one for Venice. So next thing I could do is I could just look at FlightAware and type in KVNC to KGNV, see what kind of traffic we have going between the two, and see what kind of route they use. So this guy just used OCF, the Ocala VOR, on his route. So basically Venice, Ocala VOR to Gainesville. Nothing too special. Obviously he didn't really even fly that route. So that doesn't really help us there. That's not a good flight plan that we could just copy down and cheat and use his. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to see, now that we're going to build our own flight plan from scratch, if there's any SIDs or stars we can use along this route. So we're going to go ahead and check out Venice, and it looks like they have an RNAV departure procedure that we could use, but we can't use it because we're filing slant-uniform and we don't have GPS on board. So there's no just regular VOR backed up SID for the airport, so we'll just go ahead and build our own flight plan from scratch. Let's go ahead and take a quick look up at Gainesville, see if they have any stars that we might want to incorporate into our flight planning. And they have no stars for the airport, just some instrument approach procedures. So that's cool, makes life a little simpler, so we don't have to include any SIDs or stars. If there are any that you can use, you want to try to use them. ATC typically likes to assign them to you anyways. We're trying to build a route, ultimately, that they're going to give us, that they're not going to just change. Otherwise, you might as well just file direct, and they'll give you something else anyways. But we're filing our own route, because hopefully we'll get this, and we're making sure that's legal. So we don't have any sort of RNAV on board, so we can't go direct to a fix. So we're going to have to navigate to a VOR for our first fix. So we'll go ahead and put in the SRQ VOR because that's conveniently close for us. That looks cool. And then we got 137 miles to go between there and Gainesville. Still more than our maximum of 80 miles between VORs. So then let's go ahead and try to use PIE because that happens to be right along the route of flight. And that looks pretty good now. So we're going Venice to Sarasota to PIE, up to Gainesville, all along this Victor Airway, which is awesome. It is 109 miles apart. So depending on what altitude you're going to be flying, you should be familiar with the VOR service volumes. We might only get reception 40 miles from the VOR. So that could be a little bit of a problem for us. We might want to have only 80 miles between our VORs instead of 109. Now, we are along a Victor Airway, so that should give us reception, right? Because that's the whole purpose of this MEA. If we're at 4,000 feet, then we should have reception all along this route. And if we're at 3,000 feet here, we should have reception all along this route going up to Gainesville. So if we're filing at least 4,000 feet, or since we're going on this heading eastbound, we're going to be filing 5,000, then it should work out for us. And of course, this minimum obstacle clearance altitude, MOCA, 1,700 feet only guarantees you signal reception within 26 miles of the VOR. So that could work. Or if we've got, some janky old radios, maybe we want to only give ourselves 80 miles between the two VORs. So then we could do it a little different. We could throw in the Ocala VOR into the mix, and that could help guarantee a little bit better signal reception. So now we've got just 80 miles to cover between St. Petersburg and Ocala, and then 31 miles to go to Gainesville. So we're off of a depicted route, but we should have signal reception. And if we want to stay on a depicted route, I could just throw nits in there. And so that keeps us on a protected route, throwing nits in there, and gives us just a little bit better, self-reassurance that we're going to have good obstacle clearance if we're flying higher than these MEAs, and good signal reception. So we've got our route drawn out now, and now we have a total mileage of 163. So even though we have to do this whole jog around weird thing, we didn't really add that many miles. We only added 6 miles to our entire flight. So it's not a lot of time, really. Next thing, it says an hour and 30 ETA, but that's based on whatever aircraft's plugged into this software. So hopefully on your iPad or on your home computer, you've plugged in all of the specs on your airplane, because although an E6B is awesome, we don't have 5 hours to plan this flight. So I'd rather just use technology. Slide rules are cool too, but everyone uses calculators now, so we might as well too. So pull out ForeFlight, Garmin Pilot, SkyVector, whatever it is you're using, plug in all that specific data for your aircraft, your climb speeds, your climb fuel burns, cruise air speeds, descent speeds, everything like that, the rates of climb that you can get, rate of descent that you're going to use. Plug it all in, let it calculate it for you. So then that way it's just going to spit out a number of how much fuel it's going to take us, how much time it's going to take us. And that makes it easier when it comes time for us to start filling out this. And although we're probably just going to file through our iPad, we still want to fill one of these out because this is part of our checklist to make sure we don't miss any important information. So we can go ahead and throw in true airspeeds that we're going to fly. If you're unsure even from your Garmin Pilot what your true airspeed is going to be, if it doesn't tell you, then just look in your POH, calculate your temperature, your altitude, everything like that, and get an idea of what your true airspeed is going to be along the route of flight. And start filling this guy out. So you're going to be IFR, you know your identification, you know your equipment. At this point we're slant-uniform. We'll put in true airspeed of like 120 knots. And departure point, our departure time, cruising altitude, the route of flight we've got, the destination we've got, estimated time it's going to take us we've got, any remarks we want to throw in there, fuel on board we have, and any alternate airports. So now, next comes start looking at the weather. So on SkyVector I can just kick on some layers here and turn on weather radar so I can start looking and seeing what kind of weather is out there. Luckily in Florida right now the weather's great and there's really no radar images shown back, so it doesn't mean it's totally clear, it just means no rain. Next thing I can do is turn on some of these AIRMET layers, see if there's any AIRMETs out there, and it turns out there are. So we got an AIRMET for moderate turbulence, and it looks like, AIRMET Tango, valid that time, and let's see, between flight level 180 and flight level 410, so I'm going to go with that's not applicable to us. Go ahead and turn those off just to clean up the map again for us. Can go ahead and look at some SIGMETs. Nothing comes up, that's good news. And we'll go ahead and pull up our textual weather. So in Gainesville, we've got pretty good weather on the METAR right now, and for whatever reason, it's not giving me a TAF. So for some strange reason, it won't give me a TAF, but let's just go ahead and say for our time of departure, time of arrival rather, the 3-2-1 rule works, so we don't need an alternate. If we did need an alternate, we could go ahead and plan one, and let's just say our alternate is going to be, I don't know, Daytona Beach. Everyone likes Daytona Beach, so let's make that our alternate. So we'll go ahead and add Daytona Beach to our flight plan, and that'll give us a distance. It'll also increase our time, and that'll automatically calculate how much extra fuel we need to get there. And then we're going to want to make sure we add in some extra fuel, of course, for flying around on the approach at Gainesville, and of course flying the approach into Daytona, assuming that we had gone missed in Gainesville and had to do a go around and then come away over here. So not just this much fuel plus 45 minutes, it's really this much fuel plus approach plus 45 minutes thereafter. So that's the kind of fuel that we're looking for to ultimately make sure we have on board and make sure we're putting at least that much in that box. If we're putting less than that, we don't have that much on board, then we need to get more fuel or rethink our flight plan and maybe land and get some gas somewhere along the way. Now lastly down here, pilot's name, address, phone number. You can fill that in if you want just for notes sake, but hopefully you know your name and your address. The number on board and the color of the aircraft, and of course the destination contact if there is one. If you're meeting a buddy up there, or maybe the FBO up there, you could put in so they could call the FBO when you forget to close your IFR flight plan. If the tower happens to be closed, they can call the FBO and make sure the airplane's on the ground so they don't send out search and rescue for no reason. So we're just filling out all this stuff just for note-taking purposes. And the rest of our flight planning is really going to be focused on weather now. So we've got our route. So now we just have to figure out what we're going to be doing for weather. We already know the airspace that we're going through is fine. And, of course, Tampa will work with us as we're going through the Bravo there. So now we just have to worry about our weather. We've looked at the TAF. We think it's good. We can look at the Sarasota TAF to try to get an idea of what the weather is going to be doing in our time of departure. We can look at the METAR in Venice, what it currently is. And then ultimately we're going to come down to looking at an area forecast. That's going to be our most legal means of evaluating the weather. Now, there's a bunch of other ways to go about it. Usually you just go to aviationweather.gov and use all these awesome resources like Prog charts to check out what the frontal lines are doing, what the forecast is going to be for the 12-hour and 24-hour, and all these other awesome tools on here. Winds and temps aloft, icing. Go ahead and look at the winds and temps aloft. Even though that your software probably should have taken care of it for you and plugged in the winds aloft for the altitude that you told it, go ahead and check, make sure that it actually jibes. Say you were going to fly 120 miles at 120 knots and it told you it was going to take an hour, and you look and you see you have a 40-knot headwind, then something's wrong with the software. So you just want to kind of do a double check and make sure the computer is not setting you up for failure. So check out all these forecasts, use all those different tabs. Shockingly enough, it is summertime and there are no forecast thunderstorms in Florida right now. Usually Florida is just covered by a big green blob from the months of basically April till October. Doesn't mean that you can't go fly, just means you have to take a closer look at things. Next thing I really like to look at is a lifted index chart. So it's not always easy to find. The FAA I don't think has one on their website right now. But if we look at the lifted index chart, what we're seeing is air around Florida is super stable. And what you're seeing over here is this purple, the air is kind of unstable. So if there's moisture in the air and the air is unstable, it's likely you're going to get thunderstorms. Remember, you need both those two things. You need moisture and unstable air, a lifting action, to cause convective activity, cause thunderstorms. So it makes sense that we see the purple over there and the possibility of thunderstorms over here. So it really kind of jives together, that map and that map. So it all makes sense. And of course, stable air over Florida, there's not a projection for thunderstorms happening. So we could get some rain still possibly, but even if there is moisture in the air, even if the temperature dew point's real close, even if the air is real moist, it's showing us that as that moisture rises, it's going to be it's going to be colder than the air around it, and it's not going to want to rise anymore, so it's not going to build up into thunderstorms. So that's really good news for us. So it looks like we're going to be good for weather on our flight. Nothing crazy happening. No bad wind, no bad visibility, no low IFR, AIRMETs, or SIGMETs, so that's all really good. So assuming you've already figured out your cruise numbers, your RPM, your true airspeed, everything like that, it's already been plugged into the computer, now all you're going to really have to do is look at airports of intended use and what kind of runway lengths you got. So at Venice, we've got a 5,000 foot runway. Wow, that's too far out. At Gainesville, we've got a 7,500 foot long runway. And at Daytona Beach, we've got a 10,500 foot long runway. So I'm pretty sure that if we're going to be flying, say, like a Piper Cherokee or a Cessna 172, we're going to be all good on our runway lengths. So that's really handy. But of course, you could always figure it if you wanted. Pull out your performance data out of your POH and calculate exactly how much takeoff and landing distance you do need. Especially the takeoff distance, you still want to calculate. And the reason is, if it says you only need, say like a 600 foot ground roll, and you're rolling down the runway in Venice, and you burn up 2,000 feet of runway and you're still not off the ground, you might want to consider rejecting the takeoff and staying on the ground, because if the book says 600 feet and you're taking 2,000 and you're still not airborne, then you probably have some sort of problem, like a brake maybe dragging, tire low on air, engine's not producing full power. That's a really common one. You could be overweight. There could be a number of factors. Maybe you have a strong tailwind. But if you're on a 5,000 foot long runway, pick an abort point to choose that you're going to reject the takeoff by this point if you're not airborne by then. So that's still a good reason to do your takeoff data calculations. And obviously, a pilot with any sort of skill can probably land a Piper Cherokee on a 7,500 foot long runway when you get to Gainesville. Also, while you peek in that POH and you're looking at your takeoff data performance, check out what your POH says that you need to add to your fuel burn for taxi and run up. So most airplanes got to add a gallon or two for your taxi and run up burn on top of the burn you're going to have flying to the airports, flying to your alternate, and shooting the approaches. After we figured that all out, then it's pretty much time to go ahead and take a look at our weight and balance. Now, weight and balance is something you're familiar with as a private pilot, so we won't go into it too much. But again, consider using an app, an iPad or something to make it a little easier on yourself. Or, it's okay even to use ballpark numbers. If you say, I'm going to be flying this Skyhawk today with full tanks and just me in it, then it would make sense that you're probably within weight and balance, assuming you've already done those calculations previously. So I always do weight and balance every time I get into an aircraft. It just might be, hey, with me and a student and full tanks and the student weighs less than 200 pounds, then I know I'm within tolerances in this particular airplane. So we're always doing that calculation. We never neglect it, but sometimes we're just using past calculations that we have in our head. And ultimately, best thing you can do is just download an app for the iPad, figure it out every time, and that way you always know you're good, especially when you're varying amounts of cargo or changing passenger loads, taking different amounts of fuel, and so on. So once we've got all this done, it's pretty much time for us to go ahead and file our flight plan. So one thing I do want to point out to you guys on this flight plan, hopefully you remember it from when you're a private pilot, it's going to ask for your cruising altitude. Well, you might plan a few different altitudes because originally you take off heading a little to the west, and then you start heading a little towards the east. So you might want to go at, say, 4,000 feet, and then go at 5,000 feet the rest of the way. So you're always going to want to put in your first initial altitude on that flight plan. So if 4,000 is your initial altitude, that's what you're going to put in, and of course you can always ask for higher when you're en route, or ATC will assign higher, or a different altitude. Now, one big key thing here I really don't want to leave out is although we have Gainesville plugged in there because we were calculating our alternate, what we really want to file our route as, the destination is not going to be KGNV because that's actually the Gainesville airport. So we don't want to necessarily file that as our destination. It, of course, is going to be our destination in regards to our flight plan. So our destination is going to be KGNV. But the route of flight is not going to end at KGNV. The route of flight is actually going to end at the Gainesville VOR instead. So we have the Gators VOR, GNV. And so if you notice, nothing really changes. Our distances don't really change. Our time en route doesn't change. But our route is going to end at GNV, not end at KGNV. So when you're telling ATC your route or plugging into your iPad, make sure the route of flight ends in a fix that an approach begins from. And so the reason behind doing this, ending at GNV, is say like we're going to use the approach, the VOR to runway 25. Gators is an initial approach fix for the approach. So we can notice here that we could fly to GNV VORTAC, fly outbound, descend down to 1,800 feet, then come inbound, descending down on the approach. So we always want to end our flight plan at a place where the approach begins, or where we could easily get to a place where the approach begins, because the whole purpose of this flight plan is really for lost comm procedures. Why even bother having a flight plan when ATC could just constantly radio you and tell you where they want you to go now and just vector you around the entire time? Well, the purpose of the flight plan ultimately comes down, and everything in IFR flight planning comes down to lost comm procedures. What are you going to do if you're flying along from outbound from the Ocala VOR, passing Ledgeco intersection, and all of a sudden you can't get a hold of anyone? So think back to your lost comm procedures. You're going to proceed on your route, get to where your route terminates at GNV, and just so happens there's an approach you can shoot right off that to get into the airport. If we had filed, say instead of going to Gainesville, maybe we were going to Keystone Heights Air Park that day, and there is in fact an approach into that airport, and say we had filed as our last part, instead of the Gainesville VOR, we had filed direct to the airport, 42 Juliet, well then we would be hanging out around 42 Juliet as we fly the last part of our flight plan, and without comms, there's no way for us to get onto the approach. If we look at the VOR approach to runway 5, Gators is an initial approach fix that we could have used had we filed that, but if our flight plan was to go Gators and then go to 42 Juliet, then we're kind of stuck once we get there. We can't go back outbound. There's no feeder route to get us from 42 Juliet and no way for us to identify it back to Gators. So when you're filing slant uniform, really make sure that you have a way to get around if you lost your comms. That's all what it comes down to, is lost comm procedures. So that's why I like to file and end with a fix where the approach begins. Even if this was, say, like a star into the Sarasota Bradenton Airport, and we're doing a Tegan 1 RNAV arrival, you can see as you're coming down here, they actually have lost comm procedures, and they say, hey, if you're landing runway 14, continue track to Paso intersection, so get all the way down to Paso, and then intercept runway 14 final approach course and conduct the approach. Really simple. So they just want you to fly that 140 heading out of Maher, and then go ahead and intercept the final approach loc to runway 14. If you were landing on 32, then continue the track to Murdo and turn right to intercept runway 32 final approach course. So you're taking that 230 heading out of Murdo, and you're just flying it till you hit the localizer, and then flying that inbound to go shoot the approach. So that makes life a lot easier when you take that into consideration. Obviously, it's not likely you're going to lose comms, and there's a lot of different ways for you to prevent it, like just call somebody on your cell phone if you're flying low enough and try to rehook up with them, or listen for ATC to talk to you over a VOR. But ultimately, we have these for a reason, and if you think about it, every flight, should you ever actually lose comms totally, your life will be so much easier and much less stressful, because it's already going to be a stressful time because stuff's broken. That's no fun. So anyways, we're pretty much done planning our flight. So now the last thing we want to do is just go through some common errors, make sure we didn't make any of those. So a few common errors I want to run through with you guys are going to be failure to assemble all your necessary equipment and materials for this. So do you have current charts? Well, it's nice that we have this stuff on the website, but are your charts on your iPad current? Do you have your iPad? Do you have your FAR aim? Do you have your chart supplement? Do you have all the required documents? Next, making sure you get a adequate and comprehensive weather briefing. So I showed you a few of the things we're going to look at. One thing I didn't show you is actually calling the briefer and getting a full weather briefing. Of course, we're going to get a full weather briefing, but there's no way for me to show you that on here. To actually get the textual briefing is really boring. You can get those through your iPad, but I recommend just calling the briefer, talk to the guy, and we do have a video on our YouTube channel of how to actually call a briefer and get a regular old weather briefing if you're curious on that. So make sure you get a full, adequate, complete weather briefing. Take everything into account as much as possible. Next, study up on the airport charts. So be familiar not only with the approach plates going into Gainesville, but the approach plates going into Daytona for your alternate. Make sure you're familiar with the taxiway diagrams of the airports you're going to, so you have an idea of what it should look like as you're flying up to it. Hopefully it'll be VFR when you get there. Make sure you have an idea what the taxiways look like, so you can already brief yourself of what to expect coming off the runway, so that way it just saves yourself time, and if there's any confusion when you get off the runway, then you can ask ATC to clarify, so you're not going to run into one of these hot spots or have a runway incursion if you just land there and then are trying to fumble with a chart while you're taxiing off the runway and you've never looked at it before. Next, make sure you're familiar with the approach procedures going back into the airport that you're taking off from. Something could very easily go wrong, and you may want to come back. Turns out, you take off out of Venice IFR slant uniform, you probably can't go back if the weather's below VFR, because there's no instrument approach that you can fly on a VOR or localizer ILS. So, be familiar with the approaches going into Sarasota. It's only 20 miles away. And by the time you figure out whatever's gone wrong, you're probably going to be lined up on the final approach course to declare an emergency and go into Sarasota. So be familiar with where you're going to go if something goes wrong when you're taking off or when you're landing or even en route. Be familiar with this entire route, the terrain along it. Luckily, there's really no terrain. 2,900, 2,700 feet are our highest Arokas. Not a whole lot to worry about down here in Florida. Other common errors are just a poor choice of route. People trying to file direct or maybe just file Venice to the Sarasota VOR to Gainesville. Can't really do that because that's more than 80 miles between VORs. That's a no-go. when you're flying at these altitudes, you have to be on a depicted route, or when you're defining your own route with VORs, make sure they're no more than 80 miles apart, or whatever the service volumes are for them, because some of them might be terminal VORs, they might be even smaller service volumes. So just make sure you're aware of that. And of course, when choosing your route, consider some stars and DPs and SIDs to use. Make sure that you check what the DPs are going out of Venice. We know that we have non-standard takeoff and alternate minimums because we have that here on these charts. And on the takeoff minimums, it's actually going to tell us the departure procedure coming out of Venice. So should we be using one of these runways on the departure procedure, it is mandatory. Even though we're Part 91, the takeoff minimums don't apply, but the takeoff procedure does. The departure procedure applies. So we're looking here at Venice, and we notice takeoff minimums, runway 23, 300, or 1.5 miles, blah, blah. Doesn't apply to us because we're Part 91, but the departure procedure is legally binding. Runway 5, climb heading 050 to 800 feet before turning right. So make sure, like we talked about in other videos, that the clearance they give you is legal and complies with this. If they say enter controlled airspace heading 09 or 0, then that's a no-go. You cannot turn to 090 before entering controlled airspace because controlled airspace starts at 700 feet in Venice, and this says you can't make a turn until 800 feet. Here, coming off of 31, you can't make a turn until 1,500 feet. So be familiar with these departure procedures. They're there to keep you from hitting towers and other hard things that don't mesh well with your airplane. Other common errors are poor choice of altitude. If you're simply choosing altitudes that are too high for you to get to or too low because they're easier, maybe it's going to be a rougher ride, or you're going to burn more fuel. Maybe you're not taking advantage of better winds aloft at higher altitudes. So be aware of what altitudes you're choosing and really put some thought into it. Also, think about your fuel requirements. We said we need enough fuel to taxi, run up, fly the route, fly the approach, fly to our alternate, fly the approach, and then 45 minutes thereafter. And remember, you're probably going to be doing a go around and burning a bunch of gas at that first airport where you went missed before proceeding over to your alternate. So make sure you got plenty of fuel. Be conservative. I never land an airplane with less than an hour gas on board. So even though the minimum is 45 minutes, I'm always planning to have at least an hour or more. Lastly, last few common errors here. Failure to actually file a complete IFR flight plan, so leaving out some of these fixes when you file it, forgetting to put in NITs or PIE, or just plain out, forgetting to type one of them in, or typing them in improperly, typing in PEI instead of PIE. That's going to really change things for you. So be aware of that. Make sure you're estimating takeoff and landing distance properly, and so you're not just eyeballing it and saying, yeah, it should work. Obviously, 7,500 foot long runway should accommodate a Skyhawk, but check it anyways, and make sure you really check out your takeoff performance, especially with your weight, the wind, the runway surface, runway slants, any sort of inclines, things like that. Really watch the takeoff performance and have that abort point if things aren't going the way you want. And that goes into our last one. Just make sure you calculate weight and balance right. These old airplanes, although they say gross weight 2,500 pounds, gosh, I really don't want to try it. Most of these things can't really hold 2,500 pounds anymore, especially in Florida on a hot, humid day. I never really load airplanes to gross weight. I'll take lots of gas, and I'll take some survival gear, and I'll take myself and maybe another person, but I'm not going to be taking 4 people in a 4-seat airplane. It just usually doesn't work, and I don't even weigh that much. But it rarely ever works out. So don't try to load these things to the absolute max. If you're trying to go somewhere with 4 people, probably just find yourself a 6-seat airplane that has a lot more payload and get checked out than that is going to be your best bet. So anyways, I'll go ahead and stop talking now. I really hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you have any questions at all about IFR flight planning, please leave them in the comments below. Make sure you give us a thumbs up, like the video, subscribe so you don't miss any of our latest videos coming out. Keep up with all of them as they come out every week. We release a new one to YouTube every Monday and Thursday. Also, make sure you check out our Patreon page. We really appreciate all the support you guys have given us and really need a whole lot more to make this a complete reality, trying to build a totally free online ground school for private pilots, instrument pilots, commercial pilots, the whole 9 yards. Every little bit you guys give helps. Check out our Patreon page. We really appreciate it. As always, if you can't fly every day, then fly at MikeAlpha.com. We will see y'all next time.